Well, welcome everybody. My name is Paul R. Davis, Curator of Collections at the Menil Collection. I'm reading that. Thank you for joining us this evening for the program Edmund Carpenter and Witnesses to a Surrealist Vision, a look behind the curtain. Before we get started, just a few notes on the program this evening and a few housekeeping things. This program is being recorded and will be available on demand viewing on Menil's YouTube channel in the upcoming weeks. If you haven't done so already, please do silence your cell phone. And as always, the Menil's public programs are always free and open to everyone. And I encourage you to visit our website to learn more about the upcoming programs or to purchase a membership to stay up to date with the Menil's exhibition openings, programs, and other special events. I'd also like to highlight a related upcoming program on Wednesday, January 18th in the new year, a conversation with artist Matt Manalo. Manalo runs an alternative art space, a Leaf Art House, a hub for creativity that highlights the cultural richness and multiple communities within Houston. Matt and I will be talking about the history and subject of a print on view and witnesses to a Surrealist Vision, which has been included as part of the exhibition since 1999. For Matt, he's been thinking about its history and how it relates to his work as one of the leaders of the Philippine X Artists of Houston, a collective of visual, performing, literary, and culinary artists in Houston. So tonight's program has been organized in recognition of the centenary of anthropologist Edmund Carpenter. In 1999, the Menil Collection opened Witnesses to a Surrealist Vision, an ongoing exhibition conceived by Carpenter that emulates the displays in the studios and homes of Surrealist artists, as well as the cabinets of curiosities, or Wunderkammern, in early natural history museums. It is packed with, the exhibition at the Menil is packed with a display of 300 works, paintings, prints, tourists, curios, 19th century European imaging devices, and objects found from the indigenous peoples of the Americas and Pacific Islands. Carpenter's last exhibition at the Menil was Upside Down, Arctic Realities. He died in July 2011, shortly before this exhibition closed at the Menil. It was an incredible exhibition and made Art Forum's top 10 list in 2011. It made #1, beating out Walter de Maria, the other Menil show, which was also on the list, which was Walter de Maria. By the way, we have a really wonderful Walter de Maria exhibit ongoing at the moment. I'm pleased to be joined in conversation this evening with two excellent colleagues, with Sean Mooney, who is Chief Curator of Rock Foundation. We welcome back a familiar friend to the Menil. In 2015, he curated the exhibition Microcosmos, Details from the Carpenter Collection of Arctic Art, which included the Menil's first digital publication, Wolf and Caribou, 2 Yupik Masks. And you can go on to the Menil's website and find that digital publication still there. More recently, Sean has curated the exhibition Yua, Henri Matisse, and the Inner Arctic Spirit at the Heard Museum in Phoenix, Arizona. And then further to my right, Dr. Natalie Dupêcher is the Menil's Associate Curator of Modern Art and oversees the museum's collection of Surrealism. Most recently, Natalie co-curated a major retrospective of the work of Merit Oppenheim. The exhibition was at the Menil this spring and summer, and recently opened at the New York Museum of Modern Art. And it will be on view there till March 2023. So, if you're in New York, you can see that exhibition, and you can also see Sean's exhibition at the Tambourine Gallery of Natalie de Menil's photography from Papua New Guinea. So, in discussing Witnesses to a Surrealist Vision, tonight's conversation highlights one of Carpenter's lasting contributions to the Menil. We plan to explore the history and mythology of the exhibition, its references to Surrealism, and some more recent perspectives of the works that are on view. Our conversation will last about 50 minutes, maybe a little longer. There's a lot to talk about. We will then open up the floor for a few questions from the audience. Please kindly hold your questions until then, so that we can come around to you with a microphone. So please welcome Sean and Natalie.
Thank you. Am I on? Thank you. Nice to see you all tonight, and it's really nice to be kind of home again. It's been a long time since I've been on this stage. I think the last time I was here, I gave a talk about TED, and I had laryngitis, and it all went bad. So hopefully tonight we'll be in better shape. I want to give you just a very quick overview of why we're doing this presentation. It is the Carpenter Centennial. So there are a series of, we're calling them TED Talks, about TED and his wife Natalie de Menil, who of course is the family from the founders of the museum. So I met Ted and Adelaide in 2002 when they were planning originally the first installation of the Upside Down exhibition at the Musée de Quai Branly, which just had opened or was in the planning stages still at that point. They had been invited to exhibit their collection, and Ted chose to expand that particular project into a larger exhibition of paleo Arctic art, of which his collection is probably, I'm arguing, the largest of its kind. And so the images that you see right now are from the Paris installation of Upside Down in 2008. And you notice this hand on the floor, which is a video projection. Ted had been working on an experimental film in the 1950s, and that hand is the hand of the guy on the right, Ahwenewek. And Ahwenewek was an Inuit leader of a family that Ted had wintered with in 1950-51. And again in 1955, he went back, and Ahwenewek had passed away by then. But Ahwenewek was an important figure for Ted in terms of his original Arctic fieldwork. He wasn't alone in the 50s up in the Arctic. He was Father Marcel Rio was an Oblate missionary, and sort of as an interlocutor for a number of other people. What's interesting about Ted's fieldwork in the Arctic in the 50s is that he published his first field notes in the American Journal of Psychology, and there were other doctors and psychiatrists going to the Arctic at the same time. I've also kind of posited in tracing his steps that he went to exactly the same places that Franz Boas went to in the 1880s. And Ted was also kind of obsessed with mapping, and he published a number of Inuit drawn maps as well as explorers maps from the 18th, 19th century. So this idea of media and perception was really important. And one of the things about the Upside Down show is that you think about what Ted was doing in the 1950s. He was teaching with Marshall McLuhan at the University of Toronto, and the two of them are considered pioneers of media theory. McLuhan is much more known for that, but Ted equally thought about that from his experience in the Arctic, and the two of them were working on a series of journals called Explorations that were published. There were 9 of them published in the 50s, and these are sort of the founding documents of media theory. And Ted didn't really come up with this term, but he pushed it a lot, which was acoustic space, where he talked about the sensory perceptions that one experienced in a place like the Arctic, where you would lose your sense of vision between whiteout conditions or between months of total darkness. And so this sort of logic fed into Upside Down and other things. Now, going back a decade, this is Ted in 1939, at the age of 17, doing his first fieldwork in archaeology. And he continued doing archaeology throughout his life. The second photo is of him after the war. He was a lieutenant in the Marines, served in the South Pacific, and did his PhD on the Sugar Run excavation site in Pennsylvania. He did his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. He studied with Frank Speck and other people. And then the last image is him in Jakob Island, which is a site way above the Arctic Circle that he and Adelaide visited between 1997 and 2006. And he, over the age of 80, was continuing to go and do field work. That photo is from August, and it was very snowy, but still the only time that one could go there. There's still a Russian crew of archaeologists that work on that site. There's material evidence that there's human habitation there from 10,000 BC or something like that. But anyway, archaeology was a big founding part of his life, and that it was really how he got his start in anthropology. He grew up in Rochester, New York. The photo on the left is in Victor, New York, which is the Ganondagan Seneca site. And this is why the Rock Foundation exists. He and Adelaide founded Rock Foundation in 1976 as a result of work that had been collected by 3 archaeologists at the Rochester Museum. And one of the archaeologists had kept all their field notes and artifacts at the Rochester Museum. And so the foundation was formed to preserve those collections there, which they continue to this day, in excess of 200,000 piece collection. Now, as I mentioned, Ted was in Toronto from 1948 to 1959 on the faculty of the University of Toronto. And Toronto was an interesting place at the time. It had television before the United States did, and so Ted had his own TV program on the CBC in 1953 called Varsity something or other, and he had another program called Explorations. And Ted it was sort of an art history program, as if one was lecturing a student hall, but again, from the point of view of media, and he actually published an article in the New York Times in 1948 or 47 on as an experiment on how students learn, and he conducted an experiment on giving the same lecture to 4 different groups, one of which was a live lecture, another was a written essay, and the other was a recording, and this audio recording, and the third was a closed circuit television, and the headline of the article in the Times was "TV is King," and they measured the results of how the students tested on each of those different formats. And then McLuhan and Ted were lifelong friends after that point, and there's a photo from when Ted invited McLuhan to stay with him in Long Island, and Adelaide and Ted's property there. And this is about a few months before McLuhan passed away. He had suffered a series of strokes, and at this point in his life, McLuhan couldn't speak. And unfortunately, I got to work with Ted in the last decade of his life and went through that same process of watching him lose his language, and it must have been equally as poignant for McLuhan as it was for Ted. For somebody whose main tool is language, McLuhan especially. And one of the things about McLuhan that speaks to their friendship and their closeness is that Ted actually ghost wrote a book for McLuhan, which he then republished in 1973, I think, called "They Became What They Beheld." And the reason he ghost wrote it for McLuhan is McLuhan had a contract to do this book as a series of articles, and he had to have a brain surgery from a stroke and couldn't fulfill the contract, but needed the money for the surgery. So Ted wrote it for him and then republished it under his own name several years later. So after Ted was working with McLuhan in the 50s, he left for California in 1959 to start the visual anthropology program at Cal State Northridge. It was a new campus at the time. And he gathered a number of jazz musicians and filmmakers and various artists. Alan Lomax's sister was on the faculty. Charles and Ray Eames were on the faculty. And they were experimenting with approaching anthropology from all these media angles and all these different poetic tools. This is a still from an experimental film that Ted started with Bob Cannon, who was a cartoonist known for Mr. Magoo. And they were close friends, and Bob Cannon died in 1965, I believe, so they abandoned this film. But what's interesting here is these Yupik masks that Ted was very interested in. This is sort of our entree into, or his entree into surrealism, because the collecting history of these masks go through surrealist hands, and a number of these pieces are here. The piece on the right, and I'm going to avoid going into all kinds of asides because I can really talk for hours about Ted and how we've continued his work, but the term in Yupik is kaginakut, which is a pair of masks or multiple of masks. Kaginakuk is a singular. But there's a special term called ikalarit, which is a symmetrical pair of masks, where one is the reflection of the other. And when these masks were first collected in the early 19th century, between 1902 and 1906 or 8, they all came from the same village of Napaskiak, which was next to the trading post in Bethel. And so Yupik mask performance is often very symmetrical. It's a sort of a storytelling ceremony. And when they were first field collected, they were sent to George High at the Museum of American Indian in New York. This is Philadelphia before, but never mind. When they were first received, High would receive these masks that looked like duplicates, and he would immediately divorce them because it's like, well, I've got 2 of these, I'll put one in the museum, I'll put the other in storage. So from the beginning of the collecting history, these masks were separated, and Ted had informed me and other people about this history and to say, like, we would really do well to try to reunite these numerous pairs of masks. So in the Upside Down show, we were able to reunite this mask that's on the right. Both of these masks are in the Smithsonian, now part of the NMAI collection, but it was one of 3 known masks, one of which Ted owned, and the other, which is here now, and the other still remaining in the Smithsonian. We were able to reunite those 2 in Paris for the Upside Down show. But later, over time, we were able to reunite the wolf and caribou here in 2014. The exhibition that Paul mentioned that I worked on at the Heard Museum in 2018, we were able to get together 40 related masks for the first time in 100 years. And this particular pair, the one on the right, we discovered the name of the artist, whose name is Ikalrenyuk. And they were all made by the same person. We were able to track down the family. And it's one of those things that always bothered Ted and bothered me too. Let's say, like, well, this is only 3 generations back. It's not like ancient history. So I'm happy that Ted sort of started this little research journey. So then at the end of the 1960s, he meets Natalie de Menil. He goes to New York. There's all kinds of mysteries about how they met. I have a few different pieces of information that I've gathered from both Adelaide and other people. But in 1969, Ted was invited by the Australian government to perform a study of the impact of media on the native populations of Papua New Guinea. Papua was an Australian colony at the time, and they were planning to grant independence to Papua. It actually happened in 1975. And this is a culture that had been farming in the highlands since 7000 BC. It's still one of the most diverse populations in the world. There's over 800 spoken languages, over 1,000 ethnic groups, and an extremely remote culture that in many cases people hadn't seen their own image before. So Ted and Adelaide went there with cameras and sound recording and mirrors and all sorts of devices, recorded over 100 hours of film footage, including giving 8mm cameras to the villagers to film. So if this were a longer program, I'd show some of that footage because it's really fantastic. But Ted's conclusion midway through the project was that this was going to ruin the culture, and that one of the things that he noticed are all these sorts of details in observing how people respond to seeing something like a camera or even a telescope. He noted that people don't have a natural capacity to close one eye to look through a camera lens. And so, you see various versions of that. But in any case, I'm showing this little image on the right of the portraits that Adelaide took while they were there. They were photographing people in sound recording and in film, but at the same time, Adelaide had a really keen eye on the intimate human nature of everyone that she encountered in various trips. And so her Papua photos are a real treasure. They're also extremely warm, and I realized that this is kind of their honeymoon. They met the year before. She was in the Northwest Coast from 1966 to 68 at various times, at the behest of the Haida artist Bill Reed. They published a book together called Out of the Silence, and it's about this time that Adelaide and Ted meet. And then, let's see, how am I jumping from there to there? Oh, because of the Katsina. So the Oh, What a Blow That Phantom Gave Me is the book that Ted published based on that fieldwork. As I said, he sort of abandoned the project feeling that it really had no conclusion or no worthy conclusion. One of the results was that it started, as Papua started opening up, it became a photographer's haven of sorts, and Irving Penn went there in 1970 after speaking with Ted, and his photographs are quite different. They're stage studio photographs, this portable studio, black and white. They look like they could have been made in the 19th century. And Ted's book, Oh, What a Blow That Phantom Gave Me, reads as a media log. It's like, it literally, he calls a whole big part of the book a media log, where he talks about the impact of media, but also about, from an abstract point of view, like when the telephone is invented, the term phony comes up because you have disembodied voices, and suddenly media is this pervasive thing that swallows all of culture. So on the cover of the book, he puts this 19th century Katsina from Zuni and compares it with the Mickey Mouse Katsina, which is now in Witnesses. And here you see Ted with Dash Snow in 1987, where the two are on the shelf behind them. I won't get into the patterns that connect because he's reading that book right to Dash at the time, but this is, I guess, talking about surrealists. Ted was also, with Adelaide, intimate with some surrealist artists directly. There's Enrico Donati lived directly upstairs from them at Central Park South. He was part of this circle of surrealists with Max Ernst and Breton and Claude Lévi-Strauss, who were in New York during the war as refugees in the 40s, and had the opportunity to collect or add to their collections of indigenous arts, mostly Native American. So you see here this fantastic Yupik mask that's on the back wall in Donati's studio, and There's a mate to it that is in the 1936 Raton show in Paris. And then a photo of Max Ernst with his gigantic HMV record player horn, mimicking the Donzacqua Northwest Coast piece. And I think there's probably some katsinas behind him on the wall, but that's it, right?
Yeah,
Okay,
I think that's it.
there we
So
go.
then
Sorry.
my transition was to talk a little bit about this surrealism context that Sean B sort of hinted at in the last slide, and think about, I see a lot of familiar faces here, a lot of people who know surrealism rather well, but why it makes sense to have a display like Witnesses sort of contained within or nestled within the Menil's permanent collection, Surrealism Galleries. So I'm showing you here an early installation of Witnesses, which we will see again and talk about a little bit more down the way. But just wanted to start by saying that Surrealism, of course, is an art and literary movement that is launched in Paris in the mid-1920s, a movement that very quickly becomes internationalized. And it was a movement that had the ambition to, yes, change and reform cultural production, literary arts, visual arts, but it also sought to change, revolutionize, transform relations between people, and really change the ways that societies were organized, and throw off sort of habitual habits of mind by giving more free rein to the unconscious mind. And so it's already in this kind of context that many artists brought an interest in arts and objects made by indigenous peoples. And in this early installation of Witnesses, you see that it included a sculpture by Max Ernst. This, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but this early iteration of Witnesses was changed. Lunar Asparagus, the sculpture that you're looking at, is no longer in Witnesses. It's currently in the first gallery of Surrealism, but it has this, I mean, as this placement suggests, it has this kind of tether to that context, because it's one of many works. Ernst was very interested in indigenous works, and it's one of many objects that he makes that reveal that kind of fascination. And so the abbreviated story of that relationship is that beginning in the early 1920s, more Westerners began to visit the Pacific Islands, and a key kind of intermediary for the French surrealists in Paris was an art dealer and photographer named Jacques Viot, who represented Max Ernst, he represented Joan Miro and Hans Arp, and he goes to New Guinea in 1928, 1930, and brings back with him this large sculpture of a double figure that became known very quickly as Le Lys. And that sculpture was exhibited in the early 1930s, and Lunar Asparagus has long been thought to be a kind of response to, interpolation of that large sculptural form that comes from the Lake Hentai Humboldt region in New Guinea. For those of you who have been to Witnesses and consulted the gallery guide, I'm sure this graphic will be a familiar one. It's printed on the back of that gallery guide. And it is often referred to as the Surrealist map of the world, but is actually published with the title of The World in the Time of the Surrealists. It appears in a Belgian publication called Variété in June of 1929. And in a way, I think this different title of The World in the Time of the Surrealists is even more sort of to the point, or it gives a different sense than just calling it the Surrealist map of the world. It almost seems to say, not this is our vision of the world or our perspective on the world, although of course it was, or it was a sort of fantasy of the world, but it's with this phrasing, it's almost more asserting, like, no, this is our factual reporting on the world as it exists in the time of the Surrealists. So what this map, I mean, there's a lot that could be said about this map, and I'm trying to keep it brief, but you can see how it decenters sort of the map of the world that we are more familiar with. So, and it has distorted or exaggerated and shrunk different parts of the world, in part in accordance with Surrealist regions that they were interested in or sort of points that they wanted to make. So you see that Peru, Mexico, and Alaska have been expanded. Russia looms large on the map. This is a moment when the Surrealists are closer to the Communist Party, although that relationship is a shifting one throughout the 20s and early 30s. And also part of the context in which this map appeared is this growing and very important anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism of the movement that had really been a part of it even from the beginning in the mid-1920s. So they had, in 1924, opposed the war in Morocco. In 1931, perhaps the most famous, or one of the most well-known, at least, instances of French Surrealist opposition to colonialism is when they opposed the International Colonial Exhibition that's mounted in Paris, and then mount their own counter exhibition that fall in October of 1931. It's a show that's called The Truth About the Colonies, and it's a scathing critique of European colonialism, of imperialist expansion, and so this is very much in part of the context to what's going on in that moment in the 20s and 30s. And the other point that I was wanting to make in this sort of historical dive into the Surrealist connection is that the Surrealists also had a history of mounting exhibitions that combined objects from different time periods, different geographies, and these sort of heterogeneous displays that also appear in witnesses, I guess. And so in 1936, there's a very well-known exhibition in Paris called the Surrealist Exhibition of Objects, pointedly not the Exhibition of Surrealist Objects, because it doesn't just present works made by artists like Joan Miro or Hans Arp or Max Ernst, although it does do that too. It also includes natural objects, found objects, and as I'm highlighting here, American objects and what they called oceanic objects. And these are all displayed within the gallery of Charles Raton in this kind of heterogeneous display that mixes up time periods and geographies. And I will point out, since Paul had mentioned Merritt Oppenheim, that this is the first exhibition of the fur-lined teacup, too, which is displayed with all kinds of different fellows in this basically apartment of a gallery. And the last precedent or model for this kind of display that I'll mention is that André Breton, in many ways the founder, the leader of the French Surrealist movement in the 20s and 30s and interwar period, quite famously had this arrangement within his apartment in Paris at 42 Rue Fontaine, which was a mix of all kinds of things. And a few things that I wanted to point out. One was the mobility of the displays. So this was never conceived by Breton as a fixed installation, but it was a space that was constantly in flux, that he was always adding to and changing. The collection was built up from works that he had picked up on his travels, and he was kind of non-discriminating in some ways in terms of what he was interested in. So there are works in here that are just tourist tchotchkes or fakes, and to him that didn't matter. He was interested in sort of the psychic charge that they carried rather than whether they were considered junk or not, basically. And it was also organized in a kind of, as I think is already immediately suggested, a sort of collage aesthetic of bringing together things that come from different worlds, different realities, don't seem to suit one another, but that they produce a kind of spark when they are placed in conjunction. And this wall, here's another view of the studio. This wall has its own, this studio has its own history that we'll return to in a little bit, which is that it was reconstructed, or a portion of it is reconstructed at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, where it's displayed behind a glass wall. This is only, so it's not a space you can walk through, and it's only one part of the collection, and it's obviously not a mobile, it is a fixed display, but it has this sort of afterlife too. So now I'm going to turn it to Paul.
Thanks, Natalie. So I thought it'd be interesting to take a look back through the development of the exhibition, starting as early as it was conceived in 1999. You can see here, this is the first installation of Witnesses to a Surrealist Vision, which opened in the summer of 1999 under the direction of Paul Winkler, and with Carpenter curating the selection of objects that go in there. But in diving through and doing some of the research on the history of the exhibition, what I found was interesting is that the exhibition didn't actually start in the corner of the gallery, the Surrealism gallery. So it actually started in the middle, or towards the middle, as a walk-through gallery in which you had objects on both sides and you could pass through. And what was also fascinating about this connection was the way it connected galleries. So you have some of the early surrealists, cubists, on one side on the right, connecting it through to later surrealists like Mata and Lam, and then moving forward into Ernst's sculptures and so on. So this is obviously not where Witnesses is today. A later plan moved it towards the corner here. And so this plan was developed, as you can see, by April 1999. And so this is the Witnesses we know today, with this this sort of small corner gallery that has this extended wall case. And it's a fascinating move in many respects, as we'll get into. But I also thought it was interesting because it's not just the exhibition space that defines Witnesses to a Surrealist Vision. It was also the gallery guide that was written by Ted in 1999. And you'll notice that this gallery guide, which was the first iteration of the gallery guide, is not called Witnesses to a Surrealist Vision. It's called Witnesses to a Surrealist Wunderkammern. So it actually had a completely different title when the exhibition opened in 1999. And it establishes it sort of really closely with its roots in the natural history museums and the Wunderkammern from the 17th to 19th centuries. But in this gallery guide is where Ted calls out the name of the purpose of the title. Is Surrealists combine these works with found hidden art, unworldly sounds, and everyday objects, calling them witnesses to the universality of their own vision. And so there we have the definition of where Ted is defining the title of the exhibition, Witnesses. So just to think about the installation of the space and how he implemented objects, you'll see that it's a much sparser installation than it was or is currently. There's a real emphasis on the Pacific Islands, but as Natalie was hinting at earlier, and we've had a little bit of a conversation about this, is that there's real emphasis on Max Ernst with the lunar asparagus, but also with things that Max Ernst might have owned or collected, such as the Worry panel that you see in the back of the wall case, the yellow and gold macaw feathered panel that's from a civilization in Peru, which, as Natalie was highlighting, was accentuated on the map. And here you see another angle of the same wall case from 1999. And I just want to point out a couple of the objects that I think are pretty key. There's the print by John Savage that we'll be talking about in January, of course. But there's also the Moreau cloth from Lake Santani, Humboldt Bay region that Natalie had referenced with regards to the figure, l'Élise. And these were collected also by Jacques Viau. And that's really their connection with the de Menil's collection, connection with Max Ernst. And then there's just some strange things. There's some strange things like the coconut shell from the Seychelles, right? That's in the form of a buttocks. There is Duchamp's ready-made bottle rack, which was a version of which was in the 1936 show at the Charles Retton Gallery. And then there's some surrealist paintings and a whole mishmash of other objects that he included. This all changed in 2001, almost exactly 2 years later. And the exhibition was retitled Witnesses to a Surrealist Vision. And the gallery guide highlights different aspects of the exhibition. So in this, they pulled out the quote from André Breton, which was, "In oceanic art, one finds the greatest effort to express the interpenetration of the physical and mental resolve, to resolve the dualism of perception and representation." And I think that's a really lovely segue to sort of like the way Ted was thinking about media and visual anthropology and the way that overlapped with the exhibition. So there were other changes, and really, really substantial ones, one of which was this section here. And this has been a section of the gallery that I've been thinking about for a while, and it's a really interesting one. So Ted removed the Wari panel from that space, and you can see that he had them cut an oval-shaped insert, and then relocated some of the objects. This is his drawing and his preparation for it. And you can see that he's including some other objects in that space as well. One of them is this magic lantern. Another is the still image cinematograph, which basically is a still moving picture. And then the other is this anamorphoscope. And finally, these last two, which is the Yupik shaman's box, as well as a Tlingit oyster catcher rattle that was owned by used by a shaman. And so we've had, over the last few months, we've had the Rice intern, Jackie Wong, researching these early sort of state-of-the-art 19th century technology of moving picture, early film, to better understand why he might have included some of these objects. And ultimately, there's this intentional juxtaposition of visualizing technology. That is, technologies that allow people to make images or conceive images and to create ways of communicating with other worlds. And so, for me, this was a direct correlation between the way Ted writes and thinks about visual anthropology and the way in which he's integrating these objects into the gallery space. Okay. So the question is, why 1999? What was happening in the late 20th century that was leading people to want to do Wunderkammern and so forth? And so what we thought we'd do is we'd open up for a kind of a dialogue to think about that. And one of the early precedents that we have for this type of gallery installation is the Primitivism show in the 20th century, Primitivism in the 20th Century Art, Affinity of the Tribal and Modern. And we were talking about the ways in which this integrates both modern European art with indigenous arts from the Pacific Northwest and the Pacific Islands, as well as Africa. and the ways in which these were juxtaposed at the Museum of Modern Art and also at the Dallas Museum of Art, where this exhibition traveled to. And you were just talking about the ways in which...
Oh, yeah. Well, this particular exhibition that happens at the same time as the Rhyme and the Reason exhibition that the Menil hosted in the Grand Palais in Paris. We have some correspondence between Adelaide and Bill Rubin at MoMA asking to borrow one of their Yupik masks, which ultimately was shown in Paris, and instead they borrowed this other one from NMAI. But you see on the wall there that Donati's mask is behind. There were influential shows. Both shows were very influential. In fact, I think the 1984 Paris show is what sparked the re-invitation to do the Quai Branly show. There's something about the Quai Branly show that I didn't mention, which I think speaks to Ted's evolution in changing the witnesses' room. One of the details that was included in the Quai Branly installation was 2 video projections that were holographic. And they're based on a 19th century technique called Pepper's Ghost, where an image is projected onto a surface with a mirror and then angled. The mirror is invisible, it's on the floor out of sight, but the image is reflected into a fabric and it creates this 3D effect. And Ted had us do that with images of Yupik masks sort of morphing from one to another in this really kind of ghostly, magical way. And the same thing was done at the entrance with a projection of a dancer. And the thing about that was that we didn't do that here at Menil in the reinstallation because of the space constraints, because this technology required a very deep space for the illusion to work. But as mentioned, Ted was a media theorist, and he was very much enraptured with this technological way of transforming perception. And I think that his thinking over time probably evolved as he learned more about what the Surrealists were doing theoretically, and the obsession with imagery and moving imagery was especially important to him.
And that seems very related to some of the early cinema devices or objects that are currently housed in witnesses, and that the Surrealists, or some Surrealists, were interested in these objects that were, by the 1920s and 30s, already like outmoded forms of technology, already sort of nostalgic, but that they were interested in for that very reason, right? And do you want to go to the next? Or do you have more on that?
Well, actually, I wanted to just highlight, so you have the 2 Ernst works on the right, one being compared to a Burkina Faso mask, and then the other being compared to a rock sculpture from the Easter Island. And you have this, of course, association with Lop Lop and Max Ernst's fascination with birds. But I also just want to quickly point out or highlight that this exhibition was very much received incredible backlash as well for its sort of appropriation, simplification of the relationship between the tribal and the modern, right? And so one of those essays was Thomas McElevy's Doctor, Lawyer, Indian Chief, which basically ran through the whole exhibit and pointed out that something is afoot, and it's essentialism. But we found in doing sort of the thinking about this exhibition and thinking about surrealism, there is another precedent for the witnesses to a surrealist vision, one that Ted most certainly would have known about, as well as the de Menils at the time, and that was I Surrealisti, which was an Italian and German show curated by Arturo Schwartz, the famous Schwartz who commissioned the Duchamp replicas. And in the exhibition, there was actually a Wunderkammern surrealist that included many of the same objects, such as the anamorphoscope, references to Archimboldo, Papua New Guinea, and Katsina objects in the exhibition. And so this clearly set a precedent for witnesses to a surrealist vision. And then of course, there's the Breton Wall, which is something that Natalie had referenced earlier. and was being done around the same time. Is that what we can say?
Yeah, I think right around the same time in like 99, 2000 was when the objects were being acquired from the studio, from Breton's apartment, and when this installation was being kind of conceived and put up. Yeah. So it's very much, it's almost a sort of, lost pair for witnesses in the same moment.
And so, speaking of Breton and the Surrealists, one of the lasting questions, one of the epic mythologies about the witnesses to a Surrealist Vision exhibition is, what objects did the Surrealists own, or what were the objects that they had that were similar? So, the only object that we can actually directly tie to the ownership of a Surrealist artist, or Breton in this case, is the tiki figure, probably from the Marquesan Islands, that was sold from his auction in 1931. There are other references in the exhibition. For example, in Naja, there is this amazing sulka mask that was part of his collection that was sold off and sort of as a foil for Naja, in a way. That was sold as part of the same 1931 auction of André Breton and Paul Eluard's collection. And you can see them highlighted here. They're the binding mask, the sulka mask, and the alima mask. We do have 3 very similar masks in Witnesses to a Surrealist Vision, but they are not those ones. However, they've been mistaken as that. And in a review of Convulsive Beauty, you can see that this mask here, the Menil's mask, was actually credited as belonging to the ancient collection, or old collection, former collection of André Breton. So part of moving forward with Witnesses to a Surrealist Vision is really clearing up some of the mythologies and doing the research that's necessary to clarify these stories. And working with a good colleague of mine, Jean-Philippe Boulou, we were able to identify where this sulka mask comes from, which comes from the Umlauf, the famous Johann Umlauf, who was a Habsburg dealer in the 19th century. And so now we're able to identify where this mask comes from and how much they paid for it in 1923, which was 250 marks. And it gives us a better appreciation of the work itself, its antiquity, and also sort of the collections in which it may have passed through on the way. Now, that is not to say that it didn't ever pass through the hands of a Surrealist. That's still to be determined.
Yeah.
And then finally, we're always discovering new connections. And so in doing the research on some of the Pacific Island works in the gallery, I stumbled across this photograph in Oceanie, which has a foreword by André Breton. And that figure that's illustrated in Oceanie is actually here at the Menil. And it's one of the many figures that Jacques Viot collected in the late 1920s when he traveled to Lake Santani and Humboldt Bay. And we didn't have this information in our records. And so we can now credit it as an illustrated publication for this work. So it's fantastic stuff, more work to come. Yeah. And the future is always unwritten. There's plenty of mythologies left to solve. And the media is the message. So please join me in thanking Natalie and Sean.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah. Thank you. The provenance research is endlessly satisfying. There is one of the things that I worked on after the Upside Down show closed here and after 2014 was getting Ted's archives, his literary archives, into the Smithsonian anthropology archives, and the joy of reading his correspondence. And there is a letter, I should find this for you because. There's some correspondence between Ted and Claude Lévi-Strauss at around this time that Witnesses being installed. And Lévi-Strauss asks Ted to get a photograph of one of the Northwest Coast pieces that he's putting in Witnesses because I once owned it and wanted it as a souvenir. So tracking the surrealists collecting hands would be endlessly fascinating,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
For sure.
A deep rabbit hole.
Speaking of rabbit holes,
Yeah. We'll welcome some questions if anybody has any.
Just raise your hand. I have a mic here.
Do you know who did the, oh, oh nice. Do you know who actually drew the map, the surrealists use, or what is it, the map of the world, or what is it,
The world in the time of the surrealists. No, it's unsigned, so the authorship, as far as I know, is still a kind of question mark. There was this, surrealist enthusiasts may know there was a major exhibition at the Met and at Tate this last year called Surrealism Beyond Borders that did a lot of work to examine how surrealism was not only a French art movement, how it was adapted and transformed around the world as a kind of tool of liberation by many, many artists who are not as much household names as René Magritte and Max Ernst. And the map was a kind of, object for them, and so they did a lot of work on the map, but as far as I know, the authorship or the person who drew it is still sort of unknown.
there's a lot of theories.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if Salvador Dali was going to be included or mentioned, since he happens to be one of the fathers of surrealism.
Well, he's in the early exhibitions in the 1930s.
Yes, so he's exhibiting of course, in those circles in the late 1920s or 30s, but is not in the same way as certainly Donati and Ernst and Breton and Tanguy and other artists.
He was sort of creating his own
that.
mythology versus relying on the mythologies and histories of other indigenous people.
There was also a lot of dogma and politics among the surrealists. You could easily get excommunicated from the group, and Breton was famous for casting people aside. So there's probably some reasons why Dali isn't included in later iterations of that.
And it's why Witnesses to a Surrealist Vision is a very Menil project, because it focuses on very much so the Menil history, the artists that were very close to the Menils, the collections that their children developed and the de Menils developed themselves.
I want to add one little observation or comment, which is having known Ted very, briefly and late in his life, my first impression of him was that he was really an artist, and I think of Witnesses as an art installation, and this was kind of in the air at the time too. I mean, installation art was really becoming a thing in the 90s, and even though this is a more historic kind of presentation, I think Ted was pretty clear that this was a surrealist vision and not necessarily a museological display. And he didn't mean for it to rotate and have its own life outside of himself. So I think that's part of the program of it, was looking artistically at all of these objects that may or may not make any sense and is probably better off conceived of as not making sense. The Spiky Man is a perfect example of that. I mean, we've been coming up with all sorts of paraphrases of what to call it. Nobody really knows what the thing is. It was called a Siberian bear hunting costume at one point. I think that maybe at one point, before I met Ted, he had an office downstairs from where they lived, and this piece was prominently displayed in that office, along with a lot of the rest of his collection and his books and everything. But one of the things that was several things that were also with it were these bearskin rugs. He had 3 polar bearskin rugs in the same room there, and who knows, somebody may have free associated that this was a Siberian bear hunting outfit. It's been surmised that it's a European parade costume. Personally, I think it may have something to do with public humiliation. It has chains on it, and it's kind of like a, like a straitjacket. Certainly would not defend you from a bear, and it certainly wouldn't be comfortable to go hunting in, much less bump into anything.
But to the credit of Marshall McLuhan and Ted, it has lived in the internet world.
Yeah, this is fascinating.
as a Siberian hunting suit, Siberian bear hunting suit.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. Its own life.
it has its own mythology.
Yes.
Because the truth is fungible, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And the surrealists would totally agree with that.
Yeah.
Is there any other questions? Yeah.
How did the surrealists give? Okay, so given the surrealists, interest in preserving these cultures and appreciating them, okay, so how do you think they would feel about sort of, I don't know, like the irony of the wonderful exhibits and learning and everything that we have here that's sort of, brought courtesy of the oil industry.
Yeah.
Right?
So I want to take the first part of the question if I can. So I don't think that's, and maybe this is just my understanding of the surrealists, but I don't understand the surrealists as preserving the cultures. I understand them as consuming the cultures and reproducing a culture of their own. I think that that's an important part of the history that Natalie was talking about in many ways with the anti-colonial exhibition and using it to promote their own perspective of the world with the map and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. But I'll let you take the second part of the question. 'Cause you're the...
No, I think that's something that we talk a lot about in thinking about sort of future developments for that installation or new materials, the more information that we want to make available about some of the objects in the exhibition that we were talking about even today, that runs from the very mundane about where on the website it lives, and so how we're allowed to, or how the sort of technology permits us to share more information and to basically just get more language, more stories, more information about all of it, more accessible to everyone, right?
Well, I really hope not. No, I don't think so. I think it's just leather. It's smooth on the inside. If it had spikes on the inside, then we would know more about what its true purpose was.
It's a leather covered with a bitumen sort of substance, like a tar-like substance, and then the nails are driven through it.
It's really sticky.
Yeah, it's sticky, and it may be partly from the deterioration of the leather over time. But again, we don't know how old it is either. It was acquired in 1973, 74, from a gallery in France and sold as a bear suit, a bear hunting suit. So
Well,
it's theatrical.
I think about this piece as akin to like the narwhal tusks that are in there. Narwhal tusks were harvested by Greenlander Kalalit in the 13th century, 14th century, and sold to European royalty as unicorn horns. And because they didn't know where these things came from, they had never seen a narwhal. And the idea was that, like we still see in certain parts of the world, that the horn was treated as some kind of apotropaic protective substance that you would be preserved by owning this thing. And so it's kind of a perfect surrealist object because it's all about disguising the truth or disguising the origin and fantasizing a related story that has nothing to do with a narwhal. So they didn't in their time know what a narwhal was. We do now, but we certainly don't know what this bear guy is. So it's part of the Surrealist program. I think Ted also spoke about this. There's some documentary footage of Ted during the installation of Witnesses, and he talked about the fact that there's nothing true in this room, that this is a surrealist's idea of what all these things meant, but the juxtaposition and the sort of craziness of the illogicalness of it is really what interested him. It wasn't meant to be accurate. I know that's a problem for you guys. That's actually have to work on that, but
I like accuracy.
I'm more sympathetic to that. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
What changes or additions or deletions would you see for the future of this?
Oh, well, I would love to see more. I'm looking at the Surrealist curator. I would love to see things like lunar asparagus and those sorts of things find their way back in too. But so in 2018, we did the reinstallation, and we actually did some really subtle things. But then there was also one really important thing that we did, which was in the original installation, Ted had thought of putting music or sound in the exhibition space as sort of a way to experience the phenomenology of space, and maybe even ritual. And so in diving through sort of the old exhibition files and the archives, we were able to trace down some of the CDs that he had created for this purpose. And we actually ended up finding out that the speakers had just never been connected to the stereo in the closet. And so we did that. And we added a really wonderful new aspect to the exhibition, I think. So if you're in there, it's every 30 minutes, there are these chimes from an Indonesian sound box, according to Ted's notes. But in terms of like the future, I mean, it's really open. I think as we learn more about the objects and we learn more about those connections to surrealism that we didn't know these objects were part of before, yeah, I mean, it's really open season.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Paul alluded to this already, but there's so much, it's not as though the research is in the past and we're deciding what to do with it. It's an ongoing process, and there's always more to uncover and more rabbit holes to go down of, provenance, like who might have owned what or what is similar to something someone might have owned. And so those connections are things that we're still very much in the midst of rediscovering or reconstructing. So we'll see.
I think we'll close there. I'd like to say thank you to Tony and to the program staff for facilitating tonight's
Thank you.
conversation. And I'd also like to thank my co-presenters, Natalie and Sean. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
And we'll see you at the Menil.